welcome to the Collegian Football Podcast. Ben Ferree, joined as always by Evan Patrick. And today, a new look for the Collegian Football Podcast. Hopefully, you're watching this on YouTube. That's where we have everything designed for right now. It's also still on Spotify, on SoundCloud, just like it was all of the previous episodes. But graphics team here at the Collegian put in a lot of work over our little semester break here. We got all new graphics. We're going to be video for the full semester this year, so you can see our faces while we record the podcast. In theory, hopefully that means you like it and engage with us more, but I don't know. After seeing us, you might not want to. I don't know how that's going to go. Might work out better for some of the other podcasts, not necessarily us, but we're happy to be back here for another semester hosting this podcast. I have a lot of big plans coming. Today's going to be a pretty simple season recap podcast, kind of looking back at the 2020 season, what Penn State needs to change going into 2021. But as the semester kind of moves on, we're going to really try to get a lot of fun special guests, people with ties to the Penn State football program, whether it's former players, former coaches, just anyone who's kind of been around the program. We want to share their stories, see what they have to say. At the end of the day, I think some of their stories are way more interesting than hearing us talk. So that's what we kind of have planned this semester in a little bit of a nutshell very quickly. But before we get into everything, Evan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. It's good to be back doing a football podcast. Been on a bit of a hiatus, and I think we're both here back in State College now. Classes starting up, getting back into the groove of things, and so I'm doing well, ready to get the podcast back up and going. Yeah.
Absolutely. We did take a little hiatus there. We're back better than ever, prettier than ever. Can't say enough about our graphics team to really make this whole layout around us here. It looks really, really good. And I'm very excited for kind of how we can hope to grow this thing, especially all the other podcasts as well. Go listen to the other podcasts that we have on this network. But enough shameless plugging. I'm sure we'll do it a couple other times. Follow us on Twitter. There's my joke. But anyway, kind of just getting into this episode. You read the title. Just what went wrong for Penn State in 2020? What do they kind of need to change going into 2021? That's what we're going to kind of look at. At the end of the day, Penn State salvaged the season. They managed to kind of bring it back after the 0-5 start. Obviously declined to play in a bowl game. Thought seeing family at that time was way more important, which I think we both agree with that decision. It was absolutely, this team was through so much this season. That was a great call by them, by the players. I feel they didn't have to go play that bowl game. But kind of going through all that, obviously Penn State this past season was not up to their standards. You can chalk that up to about a million different things, whether it was players being out with injuries, players opting out, just a weird COVID year, no spring practice, trying to do 50 different things, having 3 different locker rooms for most of the season. I mean, you could really chalk it up to a million different things. But at the end of the day, our world is still as weird and unprecedented as ever as we turn the clock now to 2021. And Penn State's going to have to find answers here this spring, this summer. And at the end of the day, they're going to have to put a better product on the field next fall, as 2 years like that could really be detrimental to a program and everything that James Franklin and company have built since being in Happy Valley.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 0-5 start, you mentioned, they definitely turned it around. And I mean, being able to win out after that brutal start was massive. And as the season went on, we talked about how that really needed to happen if they wanted to consider this any bit of not a success, but maybe just be able to take any positives away from that season. But in the end, I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It was the first time the team has ever had an 0-5 start. It was really, if you think about it, it's the worst season in program history. And you need to bounce back from that if you're Penn State. And for me, I mean, yeah, you mentioned you could really put the blame on a million different things with how weird of a year it was. For me, I think it's easier to break it down into these 3 main kind of issues that I've thought about, with the first being kind of clumped in with, I guess, COVID and the weird season overall can just be an overarching thing. But then I would say the injuries at the beginning of the season, Journey Brown's unfortunate situation with him having to medically retire, Noah Cain going down on the first drive of the season. When you lose 2 of the guys that you had planned all offseason to lean heavily on, I mean, that's going to be tough. There's really not much you can do. I mean, when you're at some point, you're forced to just start your 3rd and 4th and 5th string running backs as your major rotation guys. That's going to be tough. And then the second ties into that. It was poor offensive line play really through that first 5-game losing stretch of the season. And then they did get a lot better towards the end of the year, but that was an offensive line that ranked really highly in a lot of the advanced metrics in terms of run blocking in the 2019 season, that just returned pretty much everybody and didn't really show up early in the season. And I mean, yeah, it doesn't help that the offensive line doesn't look as good run blocking or pass blocking after you lose your 2-star running backs that you were going to lean on. So that, I mean, those two go into each other. But then the third thing is Sean Clifford not being able to take care of the ball. I mean, that really just tanked their momentum in all those early season games. And then, yeah, his ball security got under control in the second half of the season. But I mean, I bet Sean Clifford would be the first to tell you that he was one of the main reasons that the season was as unsuccessful as it was the first part of the season. And when his play turned better in the second half of the season, the team started winning. And so those are kind of the three main things that I look at when you try and dissect what went wrong with that team and how this team with so much individual talent could go 0-5 to start the season. And in the end, Kirk Ciarrocca, offensive coordinator, is one of the casualties of this season. And I think that's something that we should get into here, because that's pretty much been the number one storyline of the offseason so far for Penn State. Kirk Ciarrocca, after just 1 year being Penn State's offensive coordinator, after transitioning to the program from Minnesota, he's out. And Mike Yurcich is in. And I think that this is not necessarily indicative of Ciarrocca's failures, but the potential that Yurcich brings to this program, because Mike Yurcich ranks very highly in a lot of statistics and is a very highly regarded guy who's got 22 years of coaching experience, 15 years of experience as an offensive coordinator, has roots back in Pennsylvania. He coached Mason Rudolph and those Oklahoma State teams back in the mid-2010s. He spent a year as Ohio State's passing game coordinator with Justin Fields in 2019. He was with Texas, coaching Sam Ehlinger last season as Texas's offensive coordinator, with a team that performed very well on the offensive side of the ball. And one thing that really surprised me, because Yurcich isn't necessarily a household name when you think of college football assistants and coordinators, and I think I bet a lot of people weren't necessarily aware of who he was when Penn State made this hire, because it really came out of the blue. But Yurcich's offenses since 2013 have averaged 6.49 yards per play, first among offensive coordinators in that time, and 14.03 yards per completion, first among Power 5 offensive coordinators in that time. This is a guy that is going to come in, and he's being brought in to execute a high-powered, high-octane offense that Penn State has really been talking about a lot of these years under James Franklin, in terms of winning that explosive play battle and being able to not have to rely on these long, time draining, ground game heavy drives, which they really did a lot of this season. I remember in the beginning of the year, it was just like pulling teeth for this offense to get into the red zone and then convert. I mean, Penn State's red zone offensive numbers were also horrible throughout the year, but I think it's a great hire. And it's just the nature of college football, really. It's really weird to see Kirk Ciarrocca gone after 1 year, especially because everyone loved the hire out of him coming out of Minnesota. I remember the narrative around the Ciarrocca hire was like, oh, this is really smart. This is a good idea, because his offense in 2019 with Minnesota, Tanner Morgan, Tyler Johnson, Rashad Bateman was incredible. But that's the nature of college football. If the way I saw it was, this was an opportunity to hire a guy that was too good to pass up for James Franklin and his staff. He's so talented that I think it's going to likely pay dividends for this team. But hey, in the end, we all thought Kirk Ciarrocca was going to turn this offense into something that it really didn't end up being in the 2020 season.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you mentioned the quarterback track record of Yurcich and just his work with Mason Rudolph, his work with Justin Fields, Sam Ehlinger. I mean, he has a long list of quarterbacks who have necessarily been stars in the NFL. I mean, Justin Fields is going to be probably a top 2 draft pick in the upcoming NFL draft. And that's not purely just because of Yurcich, but just in general, his ability to develop quarterbacks and to have them be among the best in college football and make that jump to the next level kind of through his career. I think that's a really, really big thing for Penn State at this moment. Because I think that's one of the things you look at is, if Penn State is going to take that next step become that college football playoff team, because become that national champion, I think they need something at the quarterback position to change. Now, Sean Clifford still has many years of eligibility left that could still come from him. I don't think you necessarily want to write that off right at this moment. You don't know how much the development could change year in, year out. Last season, that Sean Clifford was nowhere near good enough to get Penn State to a national championship. And that's just kind of the fact of the matter with that. And you kind of look at Penn State's depth chart. Will Levis at times kind of could show that promise, but then Penn State used him more as a running back than a quarterback. And again, that's not going to get it done consistently and get you to be one of the top 5 teams. That's going to get you to beat Ohio State. And then we didn't really see anything else there from the quarterback room from some of the younger guys in the program. So I think just the ability to develop quarterbacks here is going to be such a big thing, and the ability to recruit quarterbacks as well for Penn State. I mean, that's kind of what's holding them back right at this moment, to kind of be blunt with it. And I think Sean Clifford knows he needs to be better if he's going to continue in this starting role at Penn State. That's kind of what it seems like is going to happen here going into the spring and summer and fall of next year. It kind of seems like it's his job. Of course, Penn State, they battle for every position every offseason. But I think it would be Clifford's job to lose, especially since he finished the 2020 season on a better note, taking care of the ball. He became a better game manager, which will be my second point here with offense. But I think just Jurčić, his just ability to his proven track record with quarterbacks and developing them was something that was very, very attractive to Penn State, and something that they're going to need in order to take that next step, in order to be one of the best teams in the country. They need better quarterback play. I mean, I think you look at some of the throws watching the college football playoff, you look at some of the throws that, Justin Fields was able to make, a Trevor Lawrence was able to make, a Mac Jones was able to make. I mean, you look at some of these throws and these plays, and Penn State just doesn't have that right now at the quarterback position. And while it could be developed and someone they have on their roster, could be through a means of recruiting in the future, Penn State's going to need that if they want to become one of the best teams in the country. So I think that was one of the big things for this hire. But it was also the fact that I think the Ciarrocca offense, it was very, very methodical. I don't know how much of it, I don't think we'll ever know how much of his offense was really put into place over the offseason. I mean, because obviously there was no spring ball, a very weird summer ball, and then things kind of got started in the fall with a month of practice and teams just kind of jumped in. So I don't think we'll ever really know how much of that offense was Kirk Ciarrocca's, how much was James Franklin, how much were they trying to blend the two just to get a product out on the field. I mean, I think that's something that we'll never really know. It was a tough year. It's a tough time to come into college football, especially at a big program like that, and have all these changes and issues, and then to see it. But like you said, it's the nature of college football. When you don't get the job done and there's a better candidate out there, there's changes that have to be made. So I don't think we'll ever know how much of Ciarrocca's offense was really in place. It was so RPO heavy, which we knew it was going to be. That's what we saw at Minnesota. But this fall, it was to the point where, like, if Penn State couldn't run the ball, if the RPO wasn't working, the whole game plan fell apart, and the Penn State offense looked lost. I mean, at times it was very ugly. It was very methodical and play-by-play, which is a fine offense to have, but over a course of a season in the Big Ten, I don't know how much you're going to be able to sustain that in today's college football. And I guess that was partially an offensive line play beginning of the season, why they couldn't establish a run, get the RPO going, because when they could do that, the offense looked really good. But against the best competition Penn State faced, it just flat out didn't work. And I don't know if that's a Ciarrocca thing, a personnel thing. Obviously, Penn State thinks with Jurčić, they can kind of turn that corner. But his offense, like you said, through the stats, it's fun. It's exciting. Comes from a big Big 12 background there. We all make the jokes about Big 12 offenses, but you know what's coming there. I mean, this is going to help with the explosive plays. It's a fun, exciting offense. So we'll kind of see how it pans out and how he values. I think he's going to have the same challenges that Ciarrocca did. I mean, I think while this offseason is probably going to be a little more normal than last offseason, I think that's pretty much a given. It's going to be more normal. I don't think it's going to be completely normal like past years. Penn State will at least be able to do spring ball, most likely, and things like that. But it's going to be still there. Penn State's going to have to instill a new offense. There's 4 new offensive coordinators in the last 5 years. And he's going to have to still have a challenge at the quarterback position and say, what's the answer there? What are we going to do moving forward there? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges for him in this new job, but I think all signs are also pointing to this being a very, very positive hire. And I think only time will tell how it'll pan out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was really telling in James Franklin's most recent media availability. He spoke to the media for nearly an hour straight. And someone asked him, what didn't you necessarily like about Shiraka's offense? Or like what went wrong and what was kind of the reasoning behind this change? And Franklin didn't want to get into specifics really and like bash on Shiraka. First thing he said is, I have the utmost respect for Kirk and all that. But then he went in and he said that he was talking about how the offense, they really had to blend what they were doing before Shiraka with what Shiraka was bringing in. And it wasn't necessarily the most simple blending of offensive styles because, like you said, Shiraka's offenses were very methodical. And you got that feel a lot in the first half of the season, especially when it really felt like they were lacking the big play here and there. And it was a lot of really long drives that ended with very low conversion rates in the red zone. And I thought it was interesting because Franklin said that with Yursich, he said this in the most recent press conference, that bringing in Yursich, they're going to get back to a much more high tempo offense that's strictly spread based in system. And he thinks that that's going to translate to more explosive plays and is going to be better for the offense in terms of just overall efficiency. And so I think that is a good sign for Penn State fans in that clearly James Franklin sees that there needed to be change in terms of schematics and kind of the how the offense that he wants to run meshed with the offensive coordinator runs. And so in that sense, that's good. Another thing that was interesting, James Franklin was asked about the potential of bringing in a grad transfer quarterback. He did not downplay that whatsoever. He said that at every position, we're always looking to bring in competition. And so will Penn State bring in a grad transfer quarterback? I don't know. If I'm a grad transfer and I see Penn State's situation, I think it's going to be pretty tough to beat Sean Clifford out for that job, honestly, because I think that Clifford has, despite having ball security issues, he threw the ball well enough and turned it around enough in the second half of the season to where it's his job to lose, as you said. And another thing, transitioning into, I guess, the second biggest storyline really this offseason, Penn State's returning a lot of talented personnel that at the end of the year we probably didn't think they were returning, and the number one person being Jihan Datsun, which is massive for Penn State. And I can probably speak for you in saying that we were probably both pretty surprised when we heard Datsun's announcement that he's going to come back for his senior season. This is a guy who in his freshman and sophomore years as a receiver was really kind of looked over by his quarterbacks, wasn't a consistent target, wasn't a guy that was making a lot of huge plays. I think in his first two seasons before this year, he only had one career game over 100 yards. And then he comes into this season and has 4 or 5 games in the year with over 100 yards and leads the Big Ten in receiving yards and is just a big playmaker all over the field when Penn State needs him to be. And it's crazy, yeah, because one of the bigger storylines of this team too at the end of the year was the wide receiver group going into the 2020 season was one of the biggest question marks. And James Franklin even said this at his most recent press conference that that position group is a big question mark, and now it's arguably one of the strongest positions on the team, having guys like Jihan Datsun and Parker Washington to lean on, with the potential development of Keandre Lambert-Smith and other guys on that depth chart. Cam Sullivan-Brown returning, who Franklin disclosed had an injury a lot of this year, which was really odd because at the beginning of the season he was listed as a starter and then caught like 2 passes the entire year. But Jihan Datsun returning is huge. And I mean, I think that really, I mean, yeah, that's got to be a huge confidence boost for Sean Clifford, for Yursich, for everyone in this program, because he proved in 2020 that he's a guy that could be relied on as that true number one receiver for this program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's only excitement for Penn State. And when you bring in an offensive coordinator who's kind of known for some of these explosive plays, I think Mike Yurcich is the happiest guy that Jihan Datsun is coming back for another season. I mean, I think he's only going to continue to grow. I mean, you could see him possibly being, a day 1, early day 2 draft pick in 2022, depending on how his season goes in 2020. I mean, this sky's really the limit for him as far as his draft stock now moving into the next season. He's really betting on himself in order to continue to improve. And I think everything we've seen from Jihan Datsun, just his mannerism, his motivations and stuff, I think he there's nothing to suspect that he won't take another step forward going into next season and just continue to get better. But just kind of in general, the transfer portal has been a very interesting place for Penn State this offseason. James Franklin mentioned it in his press conference, how they wanted to be, that they mentioned this at National Signing Day, how he wanted to be a bit more active in the transfer portal. Penn State had such a small recruiting class this year that they were going to be more active, and they certainly have been more active. They brought in 4 transfers now, I believe, but then they've seen a number of players leave, especially along the defensive line. But overall, it's a interesting area right now for Penn State. I don't think we've seen necessarily this much action for Penn State regarding the transfer portal. I mean, I think it's to be expected as transfer rules continue to get easier and easier to transfer. It becomes more and more normal. But yeah, a lot of action for Penn State in the transfer portal. Not sure what to make of it right at this moment. I mean, I think anytime players leave to do better for themselves, that's always a positive in my book. And when players need to leave a situation, they need to leave a situation. That's generally how I feel about it. But it seems like for every loss that Penn State has in the transfer portal, whether it's like an Antonio Shelton, they've been able to bring someone in this offseason. So we'll see how these like immediate fillers kind of change this Penn State roster next season. Obviously adds a lot of competition for places, which Penn State loves to have, build some depth, and really makes position battles all over the place. But we'll see how quickly these transfers can kind of make an impact for Penn State.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of want to do a quick little, not deep dive, but overlook here on just Penn State's personnel of who's leaving, who they've brought in. And so the big names that are going to be graduating, moving on to the next level: Lamont Wade, Shaka Toney, Jason Owe, Will Fries, Michael Menet, all gone off the 2020 team. I might have left a couple guys out there. Antonio Shelton, grad transfer to Florida. And a big thing is in Penn State's 4-3 scheme is that's 3 out of their 4 starting defensive linemen that are going to need to be replaced heading into the 2021 season. And one of those positions, 2 of the spots that are open are on the defensive ends with Tony and Jason Owe going to the draft. And I mean, both of them were highly productive. If you follow PFF stats, I mean, they were consistently week in and week out having some of the best pass rushing grades, highest percentage of pass rushers won per game every week. They graded out really highly in PFF's metrics. And Penn State was able to bring in a Temple transfer, Arnold Ebiketie, who is, I think, going to probably come in and start right away, as he was a redshirt junior last season, had 4 sacks on the year, 3 forced fumbles, 42 total tackles. He's a guy who's established as a starting defensive end playing Division I football, and I think a guy who can really come in and make a difference. And then that other defensive end spot is going to be really interesting what they do. In my opinion, I think it's going to be Adiza Isaac. He's a guy who got a little bit of playing time here and there in this past 2020 season. And personally, for me, he was one of my favorite players to watch on Penn State because he's a guy who has that like 4.3 speed, just like Jason Owe. He's got that crazy athleticism. And he was a guy, I mean, Jason Owe was a guy who didn't get a sack all season for Penn State, but Adiza Isaac in the few snaps he played throughout the year was a guy constantly getting pressure and really being disruptive. He might be a guy that maybe has more of a natural pass rushing sense and ability to get home that I think is going to be able to step in and make an impact immediately. And then, PJ Musgrove being their defensive tackle, and what they do at defensive tackle after him is kind of up in the air at this point. Maybe some Fred Hanser. I mean, they have a lot of guys who have playing experience behind them, but there are 3 other guys that we need to talk about, or at least 2 other guys we need to talk about that are coming back that we might not have expected to come back, especially before the 2020 season. And that's Jaquan Brisker at safety. He was a senior this year, coming back for another year of eligibility. And this was pretty surprising to me because he's a guy who at the end of the year was graded as PFF's highest graded safety in the nation. And we all know how valued PFF's metrics and grading are, especially within the NFL and advanced analytics departments and stuff like that. The fact that he graded so highly and has decided to come back, much like Datsun, both of those guys could have been drafted 2nd, 3rd, 4th round, probably pretty safe to say that. And he's going to come back, and that's a huge get for this Penn State defense, especially with Lamont Wade turning pro, because losing 2 safeties would have been tough to replace. Now they only have to replace one of those spots. And then Tari Castro Fields, another guy opting to return for another season at corner. this was an injury-plagued season for TCF. He didn't get as many snaps as he probably wanted, probably didn't get to put together as much tape as he wanted for NFL scouts and all of that. So him coming back, he's betting on himself and betting that he can put some better tape out there to probably have himself a better position in the 2022 draft. And I think it bodes well, because this Penn State team, if you were to predict at the beginning of the 2020 season who they were going to lose to the draft and who they were going to retain, I think they brought back a lot more guys than they thought they would by the end of the season. And so in that sense, personnel wise, Penn State's in great shape. And then you also have to mention bringing in John Lovett, running back from Baylor, a guy who's established as a solid running back. I mean, that was a great pickup for them, in the sense that you lose Journey Brown and Noah Cain at the beginning of the year. You're getting Noah Cain back, is probably going to be the number one guy to start the season next year. And adding Lovett in is like, he'll be competing with Kevon Lee for that second running back spot. And I could see those three being the main rotation of running backs, barring any injuries that we see. So I think it's good to just have that overview of who Penn State's bringing in, who's gone. And I mean, it's never too early to be predicting potential starting lineups on either side of the ball. And so I think Penn State's they've done a really good job in the transfer portal, especially considering the 2021 class was not their best recruiting class that they've had. So they're in a good spot, probably better than they thought they would be heading into next season.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, I think there's some holes on the offensive line they're going to have to fill up and shore up, a unit that was largely disappointing in the 2020 season. So I think that's an area of concern kind of moving into 2022 or 2021. I'm sorry, I'm looking way ahead in the future. But I think that's an area where they're going to kind of have to look at, kind of see what's going on there. I think, as I mentioned before, I think quarterback's an issue where you don't know what you're going to have as far as turning the corner to be a national championship program. I think really on the offensive side of the ball, I think Penn State has the weapons to really do some great things offensively. I think defensively, they have the backbone there. I mean, I think the linebacker position, a lot of young players are playing this season. I mean, I think that was one of the big things for Penn State just in general in 2020 was there were a lot of young players, a lot of players making their first appearances, making their first starts, and that's only going to benefit Penn State in the long run. So I think you're going to see a lot of growth from players from last year to this year. I think any year where you have either your first year starting or you're getting significant reps, not necessarily a starter, but you're getting reps like a starter. When you go from that first year to second year, that's going to be a huge jump just because you've been through it before, you've done it before, you know how to prepare, you know where you need your body to be at. So I think things like that, you're going to see a big jump there for a lot of players for this Penn State team. But Evan, to quickly kind of wrap up this episode, this recap of the 2020 season, what is the one thing that Penn State has to fix going into 2021 to avoid another letdown season?
In my opinion, we talked a lot about offensive issues and structure with the Yursich talk and Shiraka and all that. But for me, really, it boils down to, for Penn State, I think this past season goes a whole lot better if your secondary is a better tackling team, if your linebackers are a better tackling position group as well, and you're not giving up monster plays early on in the season to teams that you know you're better than, in a sense. Because really at the beginning of the year, you look at it, you're competing with Indiana down to the last second of the game. You lose on a bang call. I do think that game took a lot of confidence out of this team and took a lot of air out of them, because then you got to play Ohio State, a game that you're going to lose almost guaranteed. But then the losses to Maryland, the losses to Nebraska, the losses to Iowa are the ones you need to avoid if you're Penn State. And I think a lot of it was just defensive lapses in the secondary and missed tackling at the linebacker level. And I think a lot of that gets better with more practice and more practice time in the offseason, spring ball, more time working together as a team over the summer, having a camp next fall, maybe hopefully where you're able to work in person more often. I think that will shore up a lot of the issues. But in terms of offense turning the ball over and all that, the issues they had early in the year, you can live with a little bit of that if you're not giving up big plays and your defense isn't just getting crushed and having very little resistance to plays that you should be able to stop. And so that, in my opinion, is really going to be the biggest thing heading into next year.
Yeah, I'm going to take the obvious answer and go with turnovers, like you shortly mentioned there, for a little bit. And yeah, you can live with a couple turnovers here or there. They're going to happen in the game of football. But I think for Penn State, especially in that 0-5 run, I mean, it was consistent turnovers that just destroyed their game. And Penn State was having to play behind from the very beginning because of these turnovers. The defense was put in a lot of tough situations. I think for Penn State, simply, it's just take care of the ball better, and you will see so much more success. I mean, Penn State was almost averaging one more turnover a game than they got, than they caused the takeaways per game this year. I mean, that's a big swing when you look at Big Ten games, especially when you don't have a kind of bluff of non-conference schedule to kind of deal with there as well. So I think not turning the ball over is going to be a big thing. I think the other big thing, I'll also stay on the offense side of the ball since you touched mostly defense, is just going to be converting in the red zone. Penn State's red zone offense was really abysmal for most of the season. And even when Penn State was able to win games, it got a little better, but it still was not great. I think Penn State needs to consistently convert into touchdowns. That's how they're going to beat Ohio State. I mean, you look at that Indiana game, they could have potentially won that by multiple scores should they have converted some touchdowns instead of field goals in various points of that game. So I think taking care of the ball, converting more in the red zone, turning some field goals into touchdowns are two big things for Penn State to focus on going into 2021. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Collegian Football Podcast. We hope you enjoy our new format, seeing us on video and all of that. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We're going to be doing bi-weekly episodes here. We'll be back in 2 weeks, hopefully with a special guest, our first special guest of the semester. So we hope to have you listen in then. Make sure to follow the Collegian for all of your Penn State football coverage this offseason. Follow us on Twitter at PSU Footlog and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening in.